There are television moments that producers celebrate forever. Moments they clip and replay endlessly. Moments they package into anniversary specials and send to entertainment journalists as proof of their show's greatness. Moments that define a program's identity and get referenced in acceptance speeches decades later. And then there are the other kind. The moments that get buried quietly and without ceremony. The kind that disappear from official archives without explanation, that producers hope audiences will forget before they ever fully process what they witnessed. The kind that, if they resurface, have the power to rewrite the entire narrative of a show's legacy. Soul Train had one of those moments. And the story surrounding what happened, what was seen on that stage, what was desperately hidden afterward, and why it carried such enormous weight reveals more about the show, its complicated creator, and its deeply layered legacy than almost any other chapter in its 35-year history. But to truly understand why that moment landed with such force, why producers reacted with such urgency, and why the fallout extended far beyond a single incident, you first have to understand what Soul Train actually meant to the people who watched it. Not as a television program with ratings and syndication deals and advertising contracts. As something far more personal than that. As a weekly ritual. As an act of recognition. As proof, arriving reliably every Saturday morning, that black culture, black style, black music, and black joy belonged on the national stage just as fully and completely as anything else America had to offer. Don Cornelius was not born into the entertainment industry. He did not have industry connections or family money or the kind of educational background that opened doors in network television. What he had was a voice, a deep, warm, unmistakable baritone that commanded attention in any room and an instinct for what his community needed that no focus group could have manufactured. He grew up in Chicago, worked in radio, reported the news, and hosted dance parties at high schools across the city. He called those events Soul Train. To get from one neighborhood to the next, he rode the actual trains that ran through Chicago, carrying his energy and his music with him from stop to stop. The name was not a marketing invention. It was a literal description of what he did before anyone was paying him to do it. When he persuaded a local Chicago station, WCIU, to put him on television he was working with a budget that barely covered the cost of operation. The cameras were black and white. The set was simple. There was no elaborate production infrastructure behind him. What there was, in abundance, was authenticity. The dancers who filled the floor were not hired performers. They were young people from the surrounding neighborhoods who showed up because they wanted to be there, dressed in the clothes they actually wore, dancing the way they actually danced. The musicians performed songs they had actually made. And Cornelius himself hosted with a quality that no amount of television training produces: genuine belief in what he was doing and genuine love for the audience he was doing it for. What that audience needed, it turned out, was exactly what Soul Train offered. Not representation in the background. Not diversity as an afterthought. Not a version of black culture that had been softened or adjusted to make it more palatable to viewers who were not black. Just themselves. Front and center. Celebrated without qualification. The show went national, backed by Johnson Products, the company that made Afro Sheen. Within a single broadcast season, it had reached all 25 of its target cities. By the Soul Train was not simply popular, it was essential. It was the show that launched careers before artists had management deals. It was the show that defined what fashion looked like for an entire generation. It was the weekly hour that millions of families organized their Saturday mornings around, the way other families organized their week around church or the local baseball game. Nelson George, one of the most thoughtful chroniclers of the show's cultural significance, described watching it as a child in Brooklyn. First on a small black and white set, then on a color television that changed the experience entirely. He and his sister would study the dancers carefully during the broadcast, memorizing specific moves, specific combinations, specific styles. Then that same night at school dances, at block parties, on neighborhood corners, they would try to reproduce what they had seen. The show was not passive entertainment. It moved from the screen into real life with a directness that few television programs have ever managed before or since. Soul Train was, as George put it, a complete cultural experience. It did not just show you music. It showed you how to dress, how to carry yourself, how to wear your hair, how to move through a room. The afro. The bold California colors. The wide-legged trousers and the platform shoes. The particular way a dancer held their head while their feet did something extraordinary. All of it came through the screen and landed in homes across the country, and then it went back out into the streets and became the culture itself. Don Cornelius was not just the face of Soul Train. He was its architect, its owner, and its most rigorous quality control mechanism. In an era when black ownership of nationally syndicated television programming was essentially unheard of, Cornelius had structured his show so that the content, the entire archive, and the brand itself belonged to him. This was a historic achievement that deserves to be stated plainly. When he walked onto that stage, he was not an employee, performing for someone else's company. He was a black man who had built something from nothing and retained ownership of it in an industry that was not designed to allow that outcome. That ownership shaped everything about how the show operated. Every major creative decision flowed through Cornelius. He was famously exacting about what happened on his stage and what the show projected to the world. Performances were lip-synced, and if an artist did not execute the lip-sync with precision, they did it again until they got it right. Dance moves were subject to his personal standard of appropriateness. There were things he permitted and things he did not, and the line between them was drawn by his own sense of what Soul Train should look like. The show's visual identity was consistent, polished, and aspirational, and that consistency was not accidental. It was the product of one man's sustained, intense, and often uncompromising vision. For years, this discipline was the secret ingredient that made Soul Train feel different from everything around it. Audiences trusted it because it felt curated rather than random. They knew, when they tuned in, that what they were watching reflected deliberate choices made by someone who cared deeply about the outcome. The show's visual elegance, its musical range, its seamless blend of performance and dance, all of it carried the fingerprints of a creator who was genuinely invested in every detail. But vision and control are not always the same thing, and the difference between them matters enormously to the people who have to live inside the environment that control creates. What felt from the outside like masterful curation felt, to some people on the inside, like something considerably more complicated, more pressurized, more unequal. The incident that producers worked hardest to bury did not involve an artist misbehaving on stage or a technical disaster that embarrassed the show. It did not involve a wardrobe malfunction or an offensive lyric or anything that the broadcast standards of the era would have flagged for review. It involved the people who were, in many ways, the actual soul of Soul Train, the dancers, and what happened when one of the most beloved among them refused to comply with what was being asked of her. Rosie Perez was not a professional dancer when she arrived at Soul Train. She was a young woman from New York with extraordinary natural movement and a presence on the dance floor that cameras could not ignore. Cornelius noticed her immediately. She became one of his favorites. For a period of time, she was one of the most recognizable faces among the show's rotating cast of dancers, and viewers sought her out on screen the way they sought out any performer they had come to love. The trouble began when Cornelius decided he wanted to expand his reach beyond the television show. He was assembling a music group and he wanted Perez to be part of it. She was not interested. The decision was hers to make, and she made it clearly. She said no. That refusal created a fracture that neither party was able to repair. The professional dynamic between them shifted. Cornelius began pushing her to dance in ways she found deeply uncomfortable, movements and presentations that crossed a line she had drawn for herself. When she refused to comply, the situation escalated. What had been tension became confrontation. What had been confrontation became physical. In the version of events that Perez herself has described, the only object within reach was part of the meal the dancers had been given that evening. Kentucky Fried Chicken. A two-piece dinner that represented the sum total of her payment for appearing on a nationally syndicated television program watched by millions of people. She picked up a chicken wing and threw it. She hit him. She was, by her own account, immediately mortified by what had happened, even as she understood why she had done it. The scene was exactly the kind of thing that producers moved quickly to contain. It did not belong in any version of Soul Train's public narrative. It contradicted everything the show presented to the outside world: the smooth professionalism, the mutual celebration, the sense of a creative family working together toward something genuinely meaningful. Keeping it off camera was the minimum requirement. Keeping it out of the press, out of the conversations that fans had about the show, out of the historical record, that was the larger and considerably more difficult project. The fried chicken detail is not incidental. It is the detail that opens the door to the much larger story that producers were even more determined to suppress: the systematic failure of Soul Train to compensate the people whose labor made it possible. The dancers of Soul Train were not footnotes. They were the show's beating heart. Every television critic who ever wrote about Soul Train noted the dancers. Every artist who performed on the stage remembered the dancers. The Jackson 5 famously learned the robot dance not from a choreographer or a music video but from watching the Soul Train dancers do it first. The show's identity was inseparable from the energy, creativity, and physical brilliance of the young people who filled that dance floor every week. Those young people were not paid. Not in any meaningful sense of the word. They were told they were receiving something more valuable than money: exposure, visibility, a national platform that could open doors that would otherwise remain closed to them. And for some of them, that was partially true. The platform was real. The visibility was real. Some dancers did go on to careers they might not have found otherwise. But exposure does not pay rent. Visibility does not cover the cost of the clothes dancers bought to wear on the show. A national platform does not compensate for the hours of rehearsal, the transportation costs, the physical demands of performing week after week on a stage that, as dancer and actor Full Force member B-Legged Lou once noted with some surprise, was actually quite a bit smaller than it looked on television. When former dancers began speaking publicly about the financial reality of their time on Soul Train, the contrast between what they gave and what they received was stark and uncomfortable. One dancer described the show as having been built on the sweat of their backs. Dancers who had created specific moves that became iconic styles that were later named and celebrated and copied around the world reported receiving no credit, no compensation, and no acknowledgement that they had contributed anything beyond their anonymous presence on the dance floor. Creators of movements like the Harlem Shake described watching their innovations travel from that stage into mainstream culture and generate enormous value for everyone involved in the show's commercial ecosystem. Everyone, that is, except the people who created them. The show had monetized their artistry while categorizing them as grateful amateurs rather than contributing artists. Producers understood that this story, told clearly and publicly, was deeply damaging. Not because it was complicated or ambiguous, it was neither, but because it was straightforward. The show that celebrated black culture and black community had failed to fairly compensate the black young people who created its most celebrated content. That was the story. There was no favorable spin available. The competitive dynamics among the dancers added another dimension to the behind-the-scenes reality that never made it onto the broadcast. Dancers were frequently positioned against one another, competing for camera time, for positions near the stage, for spots on the elevated risers that made individual performers more visible to viewers at home. The pressure this created among people who were not being paid for their participation, who were there, ostensibly, because they loved the music and the experience was significant and sometimes ugly. Monique M.O. Chambers, who danced on the show, described the dancer community as a family. And like many families, it was complicated beneath the warmth of the public-facing version. The camaraderie was real. The competition was also real. And the structure of the show where being seen was the only currency available, since financial payment was essentially non-existent, meant that the competition for visibility could turn sharp in ways that the cameras were careful not to capture. Cheryl Song, another fan favorite whose long hair and distinctive movements made her one of the most recognized of the regular dancers, described the experience of dancing on Soul Train as profoundly freeing. The music, the movement, the feeling of performing on a stage where the audience was genuinely engaged, all of that was real and meaningful. But the structure surrounding that experience was considerably less liberating than the experience itself. Don Cornelius's complicated relationship with hip-hop added yet another layer to the show's eventual unraveling. Soul Train had been built on music that Cornelius loved personally and understood intuitively: soul, R&B, funk, the sounds that had shaped his own identity and the identity of the community he came from. When hip-hop began its ascent in the, Cornelius found himself in unfamiliar territory. He was candid about this, more candid than was perhaps strategically wise. He told rapper Curtis Blow directly that hip-hop was not something he personally connected with. He said publicly that groups like Public Enemy made him genuinely uneasy. These were not carefully managed statements designed to navigate a tricky cultural moment. They were honest expressions of a man whose musical sensibility had been formed in a different era and who found the new landscape disorienting. Hip-hop was included on Soul Train stage not because Cornelius embraced it, but because the alternative was irrelevance. The music industry had shifted, the audience had shifted, and a show that refused to reflect those shifts would lose the younger viewers it needed to survive. So the genre appeared. But the gap between what the show was now presenting and what its creator actually believed in was perceptible to attentive viewers and deeply felt by artists who could sense when a host's enthusiasm was genuine and when it was performed. This tension split the audience in two directions simultaneously. Long-time viewers who had grown up with the show's original soul and R&B identity found the newer direction unfamiliar and sometimes alienating. Meanwhile, younger viewers drawn to hip-hop culture found Soul Train's engagement with the genre tentative and unconvincing, not fully committed to the world they actually inhabited. The show was trying to hold two audiences at once and gradually losing both. When Cornelius stepped away from hosting in after more than 2 decades as the show's face and center of gravity, the identity crisis became acute. He was replaced by a succession of hosts Mistro Clark, Shamar Moore, Dorian Gregory, each of whom brought genuine talent and personality to the role. None of them could fill what Cornelius had been simply by existing on that stage. As Nelson George observed, those later hosts were not Don Cornelius. And without that specific presence, something essential about the show's character went with him. The ratings decline that followed was not a cliff edge. It was a long, slow slope that made it difficult to identify the exact moment when recovery became impossible. The Nielsen numbers fell steadily until they dropped below 1.0, a threshold that represented near invisibility for a show that had once commanded millions of loyal viewers. Stations that had featured Soul Train in desirable Saturday afternoon slots moved it to late night, where it became harder to find and easier to forget.